First and foremost, on behalf of the Southern California Horticultural Society, thank you for joining our first ever Zoom webinar. We had over 100 registrants for this event, so it's really exciting to be able to reach everyone that that isn't able to come to our in-person meetings because it's always difficult with LA traffic, but even some of our fans from afar as well. It's really great to be able to connect with everyone. And we're just thrilled to have the opportunity and a platform like Zoom that allows us all to stay safe at home and still meet virtually to continue sharing our gardening ideas and learn from each other. So make sure to stay connected to the webinar until the very end to find out more about our next webinar, and also to announce the winner of our bird basket raffle, which everyone who is currently in attendance is automatically entered to win. The bird basket, the For the Birds basket, includes the book Birds of Southern California from the Theodore Payne Foundation, and an Oriole feeder and seed blend from Wild Wings LA. So that'll be really exciting to see who the winner is. As for myself, some of you may recognize me from our in-person meetings at the Friendship Auditorium, where you can find me live streaming our talks onto Facebook, just like this one. I am Erin Castillo. I'm the content creator for the Southern California Horticultural Society, and I will be introducing tonight's speaker, as well as moderating the Q&A at the end of the webinar, okay? Just note that at any time you can submit questions to Sandy from the bottom of your screen. If you hover down, you can see a Q&A icon. Feel free to add in your questions there. At the end of the webinar, or at the end of when Sandy's talk, we will go over all those questions, and then Sandy will give us her answer to them, okay? And so without further ado, I'd like to present a longtime Southern California Horticultural member and previous board member, Sandy Masuo. She is not only our Facebook content coordinator, but she is an editor, educator, author, and conservationist on a mission to enlighten and inspire wonder in the world around us. She currently serves as the associate editor in the publications division at the Los Angeles Zoo, as well as a faculty member in the continuing education department at Glendale Community College. Today, Sandy is presenting a slideshow on how to make your garden, yard, balcony, or patio more bird friendly. So Sandy, I'm going to give it away to you.
Okay.
And feel free to share whenever you're ready.
Okay, is it ready to go? Okay, great. Okay, so I have not figured out how to play this in full screen and still be visible to you all, or maybe I am visible to you all. So I hope I'm not making weird faces. So I want to begin this talk with, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of, first I want to talk a little bit about birds, because birds are unique in the animal world, and some of the adaptations that make them unique are things that are good to know if you're trying to attract them to your yard or garden. Then I want to talk a little bit about why birding matters, because you're all here because presumably you're interested in birds, and that interest is really important to conservation. And then I'm going to do some specifics about birdifying your home or garden. And then I want to also mention a few birding opportunities, because now is a great time to go birding because it's something you can do all by yourself and you can do while socially distanced. It's awesome. And it's an outdoor thing, which is one of the few things you're allowed to do right now. So first, some scary sort of science terms, but birds are a group of endothermic vertebrates characterized by the ability to fly, which basically means if you've ever had an endodontic procedure on your teeth, it means inside your teeth. So endo means inside, thermic means warmth. Birds, like mammals, generate body heat inside their own bodies, unlike reptiles and fish and amphibians who depend on outside heat sources to regulate their body temperature. Vertebrates means animals with spines, which are actually less than 1% of all the known species on Earth are actually vertebrates. Plants outnumber vertebrates about 4 to 1, and most everything on Earth is an invertebrate, meaning sponges and insects. So Birds, everything about birds is adapted for flight. Flight is the thing that distinguishes them. Bats can fly, and they are able to truly fly, but they're the only non-bird that flies. And there are some reptiles that can glide, but not truly fly. And so every system in a bird has special adaptations for flight. The first and most important one is they have really high metabolisms. Just for comparison, when you fly in a 747 jetliner, it takes 5 gallons of jet fuel to power that plane for 1 mile. So instead of miles per gallon, we're talking how many gallons of fuel per mile it takes. So, and the other comparison is, so it takes a lot of energy to fly. Hummingbirds consume less than 10 calories daily, but for you and me, that's the equivalent of 155,000 calories per day. So that's a lot. If you look at the backs of nutritional content on most food packaging, they gauge all of that by a 2,000 calorie a day diet, which is the average amount that humans need to get by. So birds burn a tremendous amount of energy all the time. And that's important because if you're trying to attract them to your garden, they're extremely food motivated because they are burning energy all the time. And because, of course, the thing that's funny is people always say, somebody eats like a bird. And by that, they mean they don't eat very much, when in fact, birds eat constantly, just small amounts. So birds, it's kind of a paradox because they need all this food to fuel flight, and yet they can't be carrying around a ton of food in their digestive systems, right? So unlike, us, where you eat that big Thanksgiving dinner and then you're just stuffed and then you don't want to eat, for a day, or even in the animal world, animals that can gorge, at a big meal and then go for long periods without eating. Birds have to eat constantly because they cannot carry around a lot of payload in their gut. So these two diagrams show you a chicken digestive system, which by comparison is much simpler than this goat digestive system. And animals that are obligate herbivores, meaning animals that eat nothing but plants, have the biggest, most complicated digestive systems because, yay, plants, cellulose, which is the building blocks of plants, is one of the hardest things to break down in nature. So this goat has a 4-chambered stomach. The food goes in, it moves from chamber to chamber. The goat brings it back up into its mouth and chews it again, which is what is called, chewing cud. And then it swallows the food again, which goes back into another chamber. And so it's a very long process because the goat has to get a lot of nutrition out of what is not a very highly nutritious meal. I mean, herbivores are able to metabolize protein out of grasses because they have these complicated digestive systems. By comparison, we've got the chicken. So chickens have basically mostly small intestine. Birds only have one vent. So if you've ever looked at bird poop, there's usually the white part of it, which is kind of liquidy, and then there's a black blob in it. And that's because birds sort of combine urine and feces together and eject it all at one time. And interestingly, you may notice if you watch birds, they often do this when they're perched and they're going to take off. They're about to take off somewhere because they're trying to drop that payload before they take off into the air. So birds have high metabolisms and simple digestive tracts. The two of those things mean they need to eat all the time, which means they're always looking for food sources. Birds lay hard-shelled eggs. All of them lay eggs. There is no such thing as a live-bearing bird, unlike the reptile world, where there are actually quite a few reptiles that give birth to, they call them live bearers, but it's not actually a true live birth because they don't have a womb. The females just retain the eggs inside their bodies until the babies are ready, and then they come out in what looks very much like a live birth. And there are no birds that do this because, again, if you're trying to fly, the last thing you want to be doing is carrying around a developing baby inside you or 4 developing babies. So all birds lay hard-shelled eggs. Skeletal adaptations to flight. Again, looking for ways to reduce weight. You may have heard that bird bones are hollow, which is not exactly true, because if they were hollow like straws, they would snap very easily. So bird bones actually have kind of this spongy structure. And unlike our bones and most mammal bones, our blood cells are produced from the marrow in the center of our long bones, our femurs and humerus. Birds produce blood cells in different locations, like different sites throughout the bones. But this kind of spongy structure makes for very lightweight but strong bones, which they need because there are tremendous forces involved in flying also. So high metabolism, simplified digestive tract, lightweight skeleton, hard-shelled eggs with babies that develop outside the mom's body, and very powerful muscles. So this is what's using up all that energy. Birds have tremendous flight muscles on their pectoral muscles are very developed. And if anybody's ever had duck, the first time I ever ate duck, I was kind of confused because I was looking for, you know, the light meat, and then it turns out that it's all dark meat. And it's because different birds have different flight needs. So birds that migrate over long distances like ducks or geese tend to have lots of long, slow muscle fibers. And those of you who are runners might be familiar with this, is the long, slow red muscle fiber versus the short, white, fast muscle fiber, which is for sprinting. So when you look at a bird like a chicken, which isn't a really great flyer, their ancestors come from really dense jungles. So most of the flying that they do is to fly up into trees to get away from predators. So that's why they've got the tremendous, the breast meat is white. So birds have these powerful muscles. And this is kind of a funny thing. People often say, oh, you know, I wish I could fly, if only I could fly. And you kind of have this vision of like a human that's sprouted wings to fly. But I found an artist who actually does these anatomical science illustrations. So if a human were to actually fly, you would need to have an extremely deep sternum to anchor the flight muscles necessary to lift a human body off the ground, and this extremely strange collarbone, which would also be needed to anchor the flight muscles. So let's actually be thankful for a moment that we don't fly, because that's very strange looking. Okay, so another adaptation, which we generally think of as being associated with flight, because flight feathers are what enable birds to fly. But one of the things that's interesting that we're learning as we uncover more and more fossils is that there were actually a lot of feathered dinosaurs. Now, when I was a kid in the olden days, dinosaurs were believed to basically be all sort of gray, green, slow, and you know, the going theory was that they all became extinct because they were slow and stupid and couldn't, you know, keep up with the world. And that's actually very far from the truth. And we know a lot more now because we've found many more fossils, and we also have much more sophisticated ways of analyzing those fossils. And so now we know that a group of dinosaurs called theropods, birds are actually the living legacy of theropods. And these dinosaurs, because they were warm-blooded and they had high metabolisms, and in many cases were feathered, they actually managed to survive the giant asteroid strike that wiped out some of the bigger dinosaurs. So it's interesting. We also know now that instead of being gray, green, and drab, they probably looked more like, if you look in the screen right now, in the upper right-hand corner, that's a cassowary. It's a bird that comes from Australia and parts of Indonesia, and you can see how very brightly colored its head is, and it has that big casque on top of it. And we now know that dinosaurs probably looked a lot more like that. And these are all, in this page, flightless birds, which is not to say that they never learned how to fly. Their ancestors were flighted, which we know because they have vestigial wings. So with the cassowary, if you look on the right-hand side of the picture, it's actually the left-hand side of the bird, you can see these little tiny antenna-like things coming down, and that's all that's left of the cassowary's flight feathers. So basically these birds all ended up in places where they no longer had large predators coming after them, and so they kind of lost the ability to fly. But feathers are actually now, scientists are starting to think that feathers actually are more like the equivalent of fur for mammals, and they were more for insulation and putting on mating displays, which is what these two ostriches are doing. And then as flight developed in birds, the feathers also became more refined. And then these are just, the lower portion of this is feathers that come from a emperor penguin, which is a flightless bird, and it does not have any flight feathers. And in the upper photo on the left-hand side, you can see the flight feather is slightly asymmetrical. Like a plane wing, it's kind of asymmetrical, and it has a leading edge that helps lift when the bird flaps its wings. So one of the reasons that birding is really great is because there are so many birds. There are about twice as many bird species as mammal species, and that's, you know, there may be even more. The conservative figure is 11,000 bird species, so there are roughly 2 bird species for every mammal species. And birds generally outnumber us by a huge factor. There are just many more birds on Earth. So, you know, a lot of times it's been interesting since the quarantine started, because a lot of my friends and people I know from work they're all saying like, oh, all the birds are coming out. There are all these birds. And I'm like, well, the birds are always there. It's just that you're noticing them now because it's quieter, or because, you know, you're home all the time, so you're not out and about and doing a bunch of stuff, and you're seeing and hearing all the birds that are right outside your window now. So that's what's so wonderful about birding, is once you start noticing the birds, there are just so many of them all around that there are birding opportunities everywhere. I often, you know, on a good day, walking the 15 feet from my back door to my garage, I can see or hear about 5 or 6 different bird species just in the time it takes me to get to my car. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about behavior, because if you're trying to attract birds to your yard, so by now you know they're very food motivated, and they also are birds. So behaviorally, birds vary. There are social birds. These are gregarious birds that hang out in big numbers. So on the bush tits, I've never seen in numbers fewer than maybe a couple dozen or so. In mating season, sometimes you'll see a pair. And cedar waxwings are another type of bird that I've never, even in mating season, ever seen a breeding pair, because they're just always in these big masses. And a lot of these birds are herbivores. They're seed eaters, fruit eaters. And I think, you know, being in a big number is kind of a defense mechanism. It makes it harder for a predator to pick them off. So there's safety in numbers. And then solitary birds, these are examples of solitary birds that are pretty common around here. Most of the solitary birds, coincidentally, many of them are predatory. The hawk, the egret, well, ravens are kind of, they'll go after anything. Phoebes are insectivores. Hummingbirds are nectar feeders, but will also eat insects. But social habits can also be variable. So, you know, I don't know if you've seen, if somebody, you know, has multiple hummingbird feeders, it'll sometimes attract huge numbers of hummingbirds. And with hummingbirds, the males are extremely territorial. And the way that they work is the male will set up a territory and defend it. And he will drive off any other adult males who come along, although he will tolerate females and juveniles to feed in his territory, because he's very protective of his food source. But when there's enough food to go around for everybody, sometimes you see very large numbers will gather together because there's no food competition. So territoriality, a lot of times revolves around food sources. These are 2 male hummingbirds that are engaged in a territorial battle. And it's just funny to me because most people find hummingbirds to be, you know, so cute and delicate and beautiful, and they are. But they are also, gram for gram, one of the most aggressive birds you'll ever see. In fact, the Aztecs believed that hummingbirds were the reincarnated spirits of warriors who died in battle. So not just warriors, but warriors who died in battle. And their god of sun, warfare, military conquest, and human sacrifice was Huitzilopochtli. And if you look at this illustration, on his back, there's a brown kind of semicircle and an orange arm-like thing, and that's actually the beak and the head of a hummingbird kind of upside down. And so the hummingbird was part of this god's representation. But many birds are aggressive, fighting over territory. A lot of this is not obviously lethal. It's more like wrestling. And you'll notice there's this posture. These two grackles are fighting. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there's kind of like the winner. And then the one on the ground is kind of like, "Uncle, leave me alone, I give up." Which is kind of what's happening in the upper right-hand corner of these red-winged blackbirds that are fighting for territory. And this is just, sort of the legacy of these are all examples of theropod dinosaurs that are kind of battling for territory. And then also in the bottom left, I'm pretty sure those are males that are putting on a display for the semi-impressed females in the background. And so I thought this was a great photo, because people often make fun of the T-Rex, and there are those memes about the T-Rex with his little tiny front arms. If you're really well armed, you don't need front arms or wings, because this cassowary has launched itself at this man and is armed with, if you look at the feet, the inside toe comes with a giant stiletto-like nail that it uses to basically impale any adversaries. So why does all this matter? Bird behavior, bird motivations, why is it, and why is your interest in birding important? Well, birders have always been probably the earliest example of community scientists or citizen scientists. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's a way of encouraging lay people to go out and learn and record data. And birders are really, really adept at it and really good at it. And places like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Audubon compile birding lists. When you go birding, you can, especially now with the internet, it's very easy. You can submit your reports of birds that you see to these places, and they compile them into these huge databases that are really, really important because they can be used to determine land use options. They can be used to determine environmental policies. And in some cases, amateur naturalists have actually been discovering new species and species that were believed to be extinct, or populations that were believed to be extinct. So, birding isn't just fun, but it's actually science, and it accomplishes really important things because it provides scientists with a much broader net for gathering data than they would otherwise be able to. And the data that birders submit can turn into things like this. This is an actual real-time map made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. All the little bright spots that you see on this map of the United States are areas where there are lots of chimney swifts, which is the bird that you see on the left. And chimney swifts are one of those birds that has benefited tremendously from people because we conveniently construct chimneys, which are perfect nesting places for them. Kind of like, city pigeons are rock doves, and all those freeway overpasses are basically perfect man-made cliffs for them to nest in. But what we learn also from the data accumulated by birders is species that don't benefit from human presence. So this is an indigo bunting. And if you look at these two maps, they almost exactly match up. All the hot spots for the swifts are cold spots for the buntings, which cannot live where there are a lot of people. They need to live in outlying areas. So this is the kind of valuable data that birding can produce for science. So how to help wild birds. And I know that many of you had questions about bird feeders and bird seed. And I have to quite honestly say that I don't use bird feeders for several reasons. One is I don't have a lot of time, and if you're gonna offer hummingbirds feeders, you need to keep them meticulously clean because there are bacteria and fungi that can actually make them sick. So it's really important to keep those feeders clean, and I don't really have the time or actually the patience to do it. And I would rather just grow aloes, I have aloes in my yard, and I'm gonna show you a plant list in a minute. I have aloes, and I have Hesperaloe and some others that constantly have hummingbirds on them. So I would much rather grow the plants than clean the feeders. So that's kind of my philosophy with hummingbirds. And then, you know, there's the perpetual war of squirrels and actually rats who will try and take food out of bird feeders. And I also try to discourage that because I have fruit trees and the squirrels and I compete over that enough. So I'm a really big proponent of using bird plants. And you can keep birds happy in your yard year round with some really easy to grow plants. Because birds, so this illustration on the left-hand side shows you the 3 great flyways. And these are the migratory paths that birds take. And when birds migrate from north to south and back, they are following the seasons because they are following the plants, because they are following the bugs. So, you know, it's even birds that don't eat plants follow the bloom times of plants because the plants host insects that those birds need to eat. So these are the 3 great flyways that run north-south across the Americas. So getting to how to help wild birds with your yard, you don't need a really big space. I know people with just patios and potted plants. There are lots of ways that you can encourage birds. This is a really great example of a yard that's bird friendly because it features many different types of plants. You can see there are like some cone flowers and I can't remember what those purple orb shaped flowers are in the back. But this offers lots of levels. There's shelter because often smaller birds are prey for bigger birds. So even if it's not ground predators, you know, hawks, most hawks are bird specialists. They specialize in feeding on other birds. So you need to offer cover and also nesting opportunities. So this is a wonderful yard with lots of different potential shelter and nesting materials. And I don't know if there's a food source in there, but. And this is not. So this is kind of, I think I Googled classic California lawn, and this really doesn't offer birds anywhere to hide. These hedges are so closely clipped and dense. The palm is, I don't know, there are probably some birds that would eat the seeds, the fruits from those palms, but it's kind of a barren landscape in terms of habitat. Unlike this, which I'm hoping Thea is actually in this webinar. I can't thank you enough for carefully labeling this picture, but this is a great bird garden because it offers some plants that produce seeds because for birds that are seed eaters. It offers toyon, which as you know, you probably know, birds love toyon berries. Manzanita berries are also a great food source. Plus there's water, which I would argue that having a water source is an even stronger draw for birds than offering them food because not all birds are going to eat seeds, not all birds are going to eat what you're offering them, but all birds need water. So water sources are a really important component of a bird garden. And then even the orange, which, you know, my yard is not all natives but you know, it's one way to attract orioles is you can cut an orange in half and then kind of impale each half on branches because they're nectar feeders. So they'll come in and feed on that, which is probably better for them than jelly, which is what some people put out. But this is a lovely, great bird garden. This is my yard. I'm sorry I didn't label things, and I have a succulent collecting problem, but in the left-hand side, you can see those arching branches are from a Mexican elderberry, which is, for my money, probably the greatest bird plant, rivaling toyon. It offers little birds lots of shelter. There's lots of nesting that goes on in that Mexican elderberry. I've seen hooded orioles feeding on the berries or the flowers. I couldn't really tell. I get Nuttall's woodpeckers because when the stems die back, they tend to be hollow, the pith inside. And so lots of insects lay their eggs in those. And so that's a great feeding opportunity for insectivores. Also, cleaning up too much leaf litter is bad. The first time I ever noticed Buick's wrens in my yard was when I was too lazy to put away a bunch of trimmings. And a few months later, you know, there were lots of little bugs in there. And that's when I noticed the Buick's wrens coming around to feed. So here's my bird list. These are, and this is by no means exhaustive. These are just the plants that I know well from my experience in my yard. These small trees and shrubs are really important because they offer shelter as well as food. All of these produce fruits that birds will eat. Seed eaters, Rudbeckia, Helianthus, Eriogonum, and different grasses. But also weirdly, finches like to eat the leaves of these plants, which is kind of interesting. And then hummingbird plants. So aloe and gasteria, I always see hummers on those when they're in bloom. Hesper aloe has an incredibly long bloom time. It produces flowers for like months. And every time there are open flowers out there, I see hummers on it. Bladderpod is an amazing hummingbird plant. I see hummers on that all the time. And of course, Zauschneria, which I know has been reclassified, but I just like it as Zauschneria. Bird baths are simple. On the left, you can see that this is actually a fountain. On the right are two bird baths that I put together in my yard. The top one has a little, for $10 from like Amazon or probably, you know, Wild Birds Unlimited, you can get like a little solar powered fountain thing that causes the water to burble, keeps it moving. And the bottom is just, you know, one of those saucers from a terracotta pot. The trick is you want to make sure that you put something in the water that the birds can perch on. And also it offers like, so if bees come by to drink, they don't drown in it. They'll have a way to climb out. But if you're going to put out water, oh, and this is just a really unclassy plastic tub of water I put out during that day that turned, you know, 112 2 years ago in Burbank. And this California towhee showed up almost immediately to start bathing. But if you're going to put out water, you have to be really careful because of these guys. So this is a new invasive mosquito species, and they're horrible. I went outside with the bird baths and had not changed the water recently, and I got about 15 bites just in one afternoon. So if you're gonna have water out, you need to be sure to change it often, and at least twice a week, I would say, to prevent these guys from actually maturing into adults. Keeping pets indoors, this is kind of a touchy subject, but cats and window strikes are the two biggest killers of wild birds. I love my cats very much. These are my cats. They live inside. They have channel front window, which is what you're seeing here, and channel back window. They have many boxes, many toys, and many interactive things to keep them busy. But birds do actually really kill a lot of songbirds. And then window strikes are another problem. So if you've got big glass sliders or windows, the problem is birds sort of, glass is not part of their cognitive vocabulary. So, you know, they don't have that in their heads that something is going to be glass, and they see a big open space and it doesn't register to them that there could be some invisible barrier there. So there are a lot of ways to deal with that. There are glass markers where you can draw on your windows. There are little sticky things. The one in the upper left-hand corner is kind of neat because birds can see ultraviolet light, which we can't. So you can get these decals that reflect ultraviolet light. Lots of options. Basically, my windows are so dirty that no bird is ever going to think that that's a clear space. So I'm going to count my blessings for being a lazy housekeeper. Light pollution is really a problem. Light pollution can draw birds off course, certain migratory birds, but light pollution can also confuse birds. I know somebody who came home from work, it was after dark, and her mom had left the porch light on, and this very confused American robin fledgling was just hopping around on the porch in the middle of the night, and which is bad, you know, because lots of nighttime predators. And so probably what it was because it's young and it doesn't know better, it's, you know, seeing light. And so it's, you know, kind of active and waiting for parents to start bringing them food. So if you want to learn more about nighttime and light pollution, I don't know if anybody here saw the Travis Longcore talk a couple months ago, maybe. But it was super interesting, and this is his website, and there are options for having nighttime lighting that is less, that has less of an impact on wildlife, and you can find out more at this website. Pesticides, gotta say, pesticides are so detrimental for birds. Even, you know, even birds that rely primarily on fruits and seeds for food, almost all of them are going to use insects to feed their babies. So, and native plants tolerate more insects and host more native caterpillars. And you can see this California towhee has, I think, like 3 caterpillars stuffed in its bill to go feed its babies. A friend of mine took this picture and knows that this bird was nesting in his yard. And 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat specific plants. So if those plants are absent from our landscape, so will the birds that depend on those. So it's just vitally important to not use pesticides. And as a gardener, I kind of just live with a certain amount of insect life, you know, and I even keep some sacrificial plants around. Like I leave every once in a while, I get nightshade volunteers and I leave those alone because I know that some of the moth caterpillars feed on that. So, you know, there is no, the fallacy is trying to have a quote unquote perfect tidy garden. And so you need to, you know, everything in balance. And so most plants, if they're healthy, are going to be able to tolerate a certain number of insects on them. Single-use plastics, I can't say enough about this either. This heartbreaking National Geographic photo is an egret stuck inside a plastic bag, but probably the even worse danger is microplastics, which is what happens when plastics break down. On the left, that's a radiograph of a California condor, a young California condor who came to the LA Zoo and had to have surgery to remove all the microtrash that was in its gullet. Because again, just like birds don't have glass in their cognitive vocabulary, they don't have plastic in their cognitive vocabulary. So parent birds often feed little chips of bone to their chicks because it's a good source of calcium. And a lot of raptors do that, and a lot of seabirds do that. And with seabirds, a lot of times now they're finding chicks that have basically starved to death because they've been eating, they've been fed plastic and their bellies are full, but it's full of plastic. So if you can do even small things to reduce your single-use plastics, that's really, really helpful. Birding gear, I love the Sibley guide. There are so many bird guides out there. My recommendation would be to go to a brick and mortar bookstore. I know Theodore Payne also has a lot of bird guides in the gift shop. Just examine them and see which ones work best for you, because I like the Sibley guide because I personally like to work from illustrations. It helps me, but it means for some people it's easier to look at photos to ID birds. And better still are all these apps. The one that most people I know uses Merlin, which is from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Some of them will help you ID birds, like if you take a picture and it's relatively clear enough, it'll give you some suggestions of what the bird might be. But I highly recommend the apps. I myself use a stupid phone, and so I have another technique for IDing birds, which I'll explain in a minute. But these are all really terrific. Field glasses, I don't actually have a lot to offer on field glasses because I don't use them. I wear glasses, and the problem I have with field glasses is I'm clumsy and I have a problem trying to adjust them and figure out whether I'm focusing. So I just never use them. What I tend to do is I take my little point and shoot camera with me. Even when I'm out in the garden weeding and stuff, I bring it with me. And then if I want to take pictures, if I hear birds or I see birds, I'll take pictures. And even if they're really bad pictures, they don't have to be, you know, National Geographic photos. They just have to be a photo that catches enough characteristics of the bird for you to be able to ID them later. And that's usually how I go about IDing birds. So there are birding opportunities everywhere, which again is what's so wonderful about it. If you look at this photo at the S in the Macy's, you'll see a raven's nest, and then the mate is across the way in the M around the corner. And this was at the Glendale Galleria. And then this is a Bewick's wren that's roosting in my Hoya carnosa right outside my front door. They actually nested in that plant one year. So there are birds everywhere, and part of it is attracting them to your yard by offering them food sources, by offering them shelter and nesting materials. And the other part of it is seeing them, because I guarantee you there are many more birds around than you may even have noticed. And once you start looking for them and seeing them, you'll start to notice that they're everywhere, and they all have really interesting behaviors. So I would encourage you to explore birding opportunities. Audubon, the Audubon Center at Debs Park is wonderful. There are bird walks at the Arboretum, the Natural History Museum, the nature gardens there are full of birds. California Botanic Garden. Even if you don't go on a guided bird walk, any of these places is wonderful because they have a lot of native plants and will attract a lot of birds. Also, Theodore Payne, just the grounds up there, the hiking trails up there are wonderful for looking for birds. And then this year we had to cancel Bird Day, a Bird LA Day, but this is kind of sponsored by Audubon and also Dan and Susan Gottlieb. And basically, if you check out this website, it's supposed to have all the birding activities that are going on May 9th, which is now passed, and we had to cancel it this year. But this is a great clearinghouse for looking for birding activities, and it's always the first or second Saturday in May. So look for it in 2021. And there we have it. And I hope I haven't run over time, and I hope there's time for questions. So I'm going to escape now.
Thank you, Sandy. That was an awesome presentation.
Oh, good. You could hear it all and everything.
Yes. And can you hear me all right? Just making sure.
Yes.
All right, perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and open up our Q&A portion. So we do have a few questions already.
Okay.
Just from our attendees right now. I saw that Tony L had his hand up.
Okay.
So do you want to, let me get back into my screen. I think I've lost my screen.
Uh-oh.
I know.
You've turned into a giant plant.
Wait, I think okay, give me 1 minute, guys. Sorry about this. All right, well, you know what? First, let's go with the questions that we got, and then I will go back to the hand that we got as well. So April C wants to know, what kind of plants attract scrub jays? She hasn't seen any in her garden, and she misses them.
Oh, you know, scrub jays are extreme opportunists, and in the wild, and there are a lot of them in Griffith Park, and I work at the LA Zoo, so I see a lot of the wild birds in Griffith Park. You know, they really love acorns. I've seen them feeding a lot on acorns, but you know, they're also very opportunistic. I've seen them also feeding at suet feeders. They love peanuts, but so do squirrels, and so do rats. So I would kind of go with acorns. But they'll eat almost anything. They're kind of tricky to attract. I live very close to Griffith Park, and I see them kind of at the zoo sometimes on the perimeter road, but I rarely see them actually in my yard. I think there was a pair nesting here last year, which was kind of a treat, but yeah, I would say nuts.
All right, thank you. And then from Carol B, she just wants to mention, so she's actually just mentioning more of what you said, the Birds of Los Angeles book that was published by the National History Museum as well.
Oh, great.
And we have another question here from Celine K. Will your slides be available, or a resource list for this lecture?
I can, if you can send us your email, I can save it as a PDF. Would that, if that would work for you, I can do that.
All right. Yeah, so Celine, make sure to email us if you are looking for that, okay?
Yeah,
So
contact Erin.
Yeah, socalhort@gmail.com. Franco C wants to know, is putting mosquito pellets in my water features bad for birds?
I'm going to go with yes, because I'm not really sure what's in mosquito pellets, but I'm going to assume it's a kind of pesticide. I try really hard to not use, I mean, at the zoo, because we can't use pesticides, we have mosquito fish, and those control, they're also invasive, but as long as you keep them in a pool, it's okay. And you know, in my yard, once the weather gets to a certain, you know, once we get to a certain temperature level, I just dump my bird baths, because I'm so vulnerable to mosquito bites. But you know, the other thing you can do if you don't want to use the pellets is it probably isn't 100% effective, but I think that if you can keep the water flowing, it discourages the insects from laying eggs in them. But the most important thing is to just change the water super regularly.
All right, thank you. And we have Lomerson V.
Mm-hmm.
I thought ravens were social birds. I often see them in groups. If they're not social, then would these groups be families? Thanks.
Yes, actually. So ravens, okay, so here's the thing. I have never seen ravens gather in numbers the way crows will. And I have seen, so I live near the equestrian neighborhood in Burbank, and I have sometimes seen these masses of crows, and they are crows, and they'll just like subflocks join, and they join in these great groups. And ravens are more subtle. A lot of times I see them in pairs. So there's a pair that lives in my neighborhood on this block. At the zoo, there are 3 pairs that live on grounds, and they're mated pairs. So there's Click and Clack and Edgar and Lenore, and then a 3rd pair that hasn't really been named. But what happens is sometimes you'll see them in groups of 4 or 5. And a lot of times what that is the parents and the offspring from the previous nesting season. And you're right, they do live in little family groups. And sometimes those babies from the previous season will actually help the parents care for the current chicks. And then, as like that photo that I showed you in my presentation, if there's like a big food opportunity, like roadkill or something where there's a lot of food in one place, they'll sometimes gather in quite big numbers. But again, it's because there's enough food to support a big number of them. And in fact, interestingly, if you want to learn about ravens, there's an author named Bernd Heinrich. And he wrote a book called The Mind of the Raven, but he's written several books about ravens. And anecdotally, just in parts of Alaska and up north, they're sometimes called wolf birds because the ravens don't have, unlike raptors, they don't have the tools to rip open a carcass. So sometimes what they would do is alert larger scavengers to the presence of a carcass, because once wolves or a bear or something bigger rips open the carcass, then the ravens can feed, and they will sometimes feed in quite big numbers. But mostly I've seen them in pairs with maybe offspring from a previous season.
All right, thank you, Sandy. I'm actually going to stop sharing this so that we can see your face, because I
Okay.
realized no one can see your face when you're answering these questions. So this is a question from Magda L. I haven't seen the cedar waxwings this year. I have a lot of toyon trees, oaks, woodland, etc. Do you think the increased air traffic has impacted the migration?
Oh, that's interesting. Increased air traffic, although there's no air traffic right now. I don't know. Sometimes it might be just where the food sources are. I mean, this year I noticed that because of all that rain we had late, I was on the 5 at the end of February, and I could not believe how many toyon berries there were. There were actually like red spots up in Griffith Park. You could see it. So maybe they haven't come by your neck of the woods because there have been other food sources. That would be my explanation, is they might have found other, bounty of food sources, so it might have drawn them away.
All right, thank you. And this is another question from Chelsea R. Hi, Sandy. Are there any particular California native plants or trees that would attract birds of prey like hawks? What about some that repel them? What about some that repel them?
Plants that repel birds of prey?
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me. Let me see. Are there any particular California native plants or trees that would attract, so not repel?
Okay, attract.
Repel as well.
Well, raptors really aren't interested in, raptors are obligate carnivores. They eat nothing but meat. So unlike, hummingbirds, which generally feed on nectar, but they will eat insects, or seed-eating birds like towhees are often scratching in the soil, although they do eat bugs. Raptors are obligate carnivores. They eat only meat. So really, they're going to be attracted by the presence of prey. So, and that can vary. Interestingly, most hawks have alternate names. So we know them as red-tailed hawks, but at another time, they were more commonly known as chicken hawks. And kestrels are known as sparrow hawks. And Cooper's hawks are called pigeon hawks. So they all specialize in feeding in particular prey birds. So if you want to attract them, you're probably better off trying to attract more pigeons, pigeons or doves to your yard, than trying to actually attract the raptors directly.
Thank you, Sandy. This one's from Lisa M.
Mhm.
Are non-native birds that are visiting LA now because of global warming, are migration patterns changing as well?
Actually, yes, and that's kind of what's disturbing. But it's like the effect on birds is kind of it's really bad, because what's happening is global warming is affecting plants, and because it's affecting plants and it's shifting the bloom time, changing the bloom time for certain plants alters the insects that then depend on those plants, so that most hatching occurs like it's very, the timing is such that nature wants the baby birds to hatch at a time when there's going to be peak food availability, whatever that food source is. And so when plant bloom times shift, or certain plants just can't tolerate temperature change, it means that there's a sudden lack of the appropriate food source for the baby birds. So that's kind of how climate change impacts them. They've actually discovered also, because climate change is being felt at higher elevations first, because we're all, when you're in this comfortable elevation, you're in the envelope, right? So if the temperatures are changing, you're feeling it on the periphery more. So like in alpine regions, they're finding that different plants, the snow line is dropping. And so different types of plants are able to survive at higher elevations, and they're squeezing out other plants that used to dominate those habitats. So there are all kinds of changes like this going on, and for animals that have a very narrow band of what they can eat or what they can tolerate, it's going to be very, very hard on them.
Thank you, Sandy. We're going to take one more question, and then anyone who wants to stay on longer as well, feel free to. We will have all the questions compiled so we can answer any of the unanswered questions later on, either in an email if you have to leave, okay? So the last question is from Laura B. How can you attract some of the more colorful birds in LA?
Colorful, so I'm assuming you mean colorful in terms of actual color, not colorful in terms of strange behaviors. So, because I find that towhees are very colorful birds, even though they're kind of drab in terms of hue, because they are really funny behaviorally. So the most colorful birds that I can think of are probably, scrub jays. And again, scrub jays seem to like acorns. I haven't been very successful in drawing them to my yard, because they, have a, I haven't figured out how to get them to come to my yard. Orioles. Orioles are beautiful seasonal visitors. They're nectar feeders. I mean, they eat lots of different things. Most birds are fairly omnivorous, but they really like nectar. So I've seen pictures of them. They'll feed on hummingbird feeders, but they'll also feed on, I've seen them drinking nectar out of giant bird of paradise. And also, they like to nest in palms. In fact, the only oriole nests I've ever seen have been in palms. So I'm not really sure, because most of the palms that are here are not native, so I'm not really sure where they nest normally, but trying to think of other colorful birds. Hummingbirds are often very colorful. And like I said, aloes are really wonderful because they come in all different sizes. So if you have a yard with space, you can put in aloes, like bigger aloes, like tree aloe, or candelabra aloe. I can't think of the botanical name for it. But if you have a balcony or a patio and you don't have that much space, there are hybrids and also smaller species that easily grow in pots. And they tend to have a pretty long bloom time, and I find that those attract hummingbirds whenever they're around. Gasterias are the same.
Thank you. All right, so let's pause on the Q&A right now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen again. We are going to find our raffle winner. So I'm going to tap this spinning wheel, wheel of fortune, and let's see.
Oh, and I think Carol B just mentioned also that Theodore Payne has some really good lists of bird plants.
Wait, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you over the clapping of the wheel.
Oh, I didn't get the sound effect. Oh.
Oh, well, so it looks like Joan M is our winner.
Yay, congratulations, Joan.
If you're still here, Joan, please raise your hand. All right, Joan, there you are. Okay. Email to get your information so that we can send you your prize. And also for anyone who has to leave as well, before we continue the Q&A, I do just want to mention that we are having another webinar. So if you really enjoyed Sandy's talk, then you can also join us next month. I'm going to share my video so you guys can see me. You'll be able to join us next month here on Zoom with Jeremy Spath of Hidden Agave and also Water's Path Landscape Design. So he will be presenting a talk on agaves. It will be Thursday, June 11th at 7:30. So the exact same format that we have here. Keep an eye out for the registration link. Make sure that you have the webinar ID and the password in that link as well. And just as a final note too, we are a nonprofit, a Southern California Horticulture Society, and much of our revenue comes from the in-person events that we host, such as the Coffee in the Garden or any of the field trips that you can see all of those on our website at socalhort.org. And like many other small organizations during this time, we can no longer count on that revenue until the city of Los Angeles and the state of California deem these large gatherings safe again. So if you have benefited from tonight's webinar or just any of the content that we've posted online, please consider donating whatever you can to our organization. Every little bit helps. All donations can be made online at socalhort.org/donate, or just by going to socalhort.org, and you'll be able to also see the donate button right there. Okay, so thank you everyone again for participating. We will continue the Q&A right now, so let's get back to it.
And just quickly, before too many more people leave, I just want to send everybody, I have a website, sandymasuo.com, and I do teach, I teach a longer version of this class with more birding specifics, and also, well, we used to go on a bird walk at the end, but I'm going to be doing more online classes. So if you go to my website, I haven't updated the entire schedule yet, but I teach a plastic trash reduction class that I'll be teaching on May 30th through Glendale Community College, and it's online. And I'll be upgrading that list soon.
All right, fantastic. So here's another question from Celine K. We used to have gray doves in our yard, but I haven't seen any in years. What do I have to do to get them back?
So those are probably mourning doves. I don't know if you changed any of your gardening behaviors, because that might have something to do with it. I didn't notice mourning doves in my yard for a long time. And then when some of the denser brush kind of got cleared out, because they're ground feeders, so they like to scratch around and look for seeds. So I don't know, maybe adding some grasses, something that, or even something like, wildflowers that are going to produce seeds that'll fall, maybe buckwheat. The other thing that could have happened is that you might have resident raptors in the area, because that definitely can change the birds that show up in your yard. Sometimes because raptors are really opportunistic, and that's one of the problems with bird feeders, is that I know people who have put out bird feeders, but then, especially juvenile raptors who are still honing their hunting skills, to them, the bird feeder with all the finches and the doves and everything is kind of like a hometown buffet. So that's the other problem with putting out feeders. But yeah, I would say since doves are really big seed feeders, you might try and find some plants that are going to provide more of that.
All right, thank you. And this is more of a comment from Baya B. To Dieter mosquitoes, I have great luck with water wiggler. If anyone else is familiar with
Water
that.
wiggler, okay.
And we have another one that is another comment from Anne and Eric B.
Oh, hi.
There are lots of non-native plants that are attractive to birds, such as Grevillea robusta. Mosquito dunkers are a bacillus that affects mosquito larvae, harmless to people, pets, and birds.
Great.
Yeah.
I need that.
Apologies for butchering any names also. Another one, here's a question from Clara A. I live on the coast in Dana Point. What is the best placement for bird boxes or any other places to encourage nesting?
Oh, to place the bird boxes or to buy the bird boxes?
Placement.
Placement. You know, it kind of depends on the bird box. So like I have a Buick's, I have a wren house, and so I purposely put it somewhere that I know like squirrels can't access it. So I think it sort of depends on, the kind of bird house that it is. So if you, wherever you get your bird box, like Wild Birds Unlimited or some of the other places that provide them, usually they can also help you if you ask them specifically, like I'm trying to encourage bluebirds or wrens or owls. They'll help you with the placement.
All right, and the next one is from Azita K. I loved your talk. Thank you.
Thank
Does
you.
a bird bath bear the risk of infection to the same extent a bird feeder does?
Yeah, they kind of, you know, that's the downside of them, is that they really need to be kept clean. And again, you know, my problem is I don't have a lot of time, and I also have a lot of plants that demand my time and energy. So I like to let the plants take care of the birds for me. But yeah, you know, I think also depending on what the bird bath is made out of, it can be easier to keep clean than others. But it definitely needs cleaning, because birds will, you know, their poop gets in it, and you know they're bathing in it. So yeah, it's kind of it's good to keep it clean and scrubbed out. Like that concrete one that I showed in my presentation is very rough, and after like the first week that I had it, it was already coated in algae. So I'm giving it a rest for the summer, and I'll revisit it in the fall.
Thank you. This one's from Linda F. Can you recommend something similar to Hesperalo for containers?
Aloes. I gotta say, aloes are really great, and a lot of them will do well in containers. Also, gasterias, which are closely related to aloes and make really beautiful flowers, and they bloom for a really long time. And the trick with gasterias, though, is that some of them get really giant, and some of them are fussy, which is why when I do my succulent talk, I always have gasterias in the pretty easy to care for. But I would say either of those are great, and because they're succulents, you know, they'll do well in a container, and both have really long bloom times.
All right, the next one is from Joel L. I arrived late to the chat, so not sure if you talked about birdsong. Can you tell by the sounds of a birdsong whether it is a mating song or something more territorial, or any remarks in general you might have about this? Thanks.
You bet. In fact, serious hardcore birders often bird by ear. So, so here's, okay, so I'm going to give you a website. There's a website called xenocanto.org. xeno-canto.org. And that is a huge library of bird calls. So let me give you a little example. I was behind the building at work one day, and I often, I love birding by ear. So like before I even get out of bed in the morning, I can often ID like 4 or 5 different birds that I can hear in my front yard. So I'm very aware of bird song. And so I eat behind the building. I used to eat lunch behind the building a lot. And I'm kind of accustomed to all the usual suspects, right? So, you know, finches and mourning doves and whatever bird songs I hear. And I heard something that I had never heard before. And it was absolutely beautiful. It was this gorgeous lilting, like this beautiful lilting song, and it was one bird, so it wasn't a big flock. It was, and I couldn't find it. It was somewhere in this giant dense ficus tree, and I couldn't find it. And so I stayed as long as I could for the rest of my lunch break, and I just kept listening, trying to commit to memory what this sounded like. And then I went inside and I found the current bird species list. There had been a bird walk a few weeks earlier, and I looked at the entire list of birds that they had found, and I crossed off anything that I knew it wasn't. So I knew it wasn't a hawk. I knew it wasn't an American robin. I knew it wasn't a junco. I knew, I knew the things it wasn't, and I narrowed it down to like 3 species. And I went to Xenocanto, and they have literally hundreds of recordings of birds, and they'll label it, so it'll say, male mating call, or, chatting, or, flight call. It'll tell you what the calls are. And it took me like 20 minutes. So I had to like listen to all these little snippets, but I finally solved it. It was a black-headed grosbeak, which was really awesome. So check out Xenocanto. And the other thing is, if you go to All About Birds or the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website, Cornell has the Macaulay Library of Birdsong, and that's another huge library of bird calls. And so you can just go through on your computer and click and listen to all the bird calls you want. And if you, when you're out birding, if you hear a bird and you can't see it, record it on your phone. And then you can take it inside and try and match it up with some of the files from these sites.
Oh, that's
good question.
Thanks, Sandy. Mm-hmm. This one's from Jackie S. What can I do to encourage hummingbirds to nest in the rafters of my porch? I have feeders hanging nearby and a lot of hummers come to drink. Okay,
never get rid of spider webbing. Never get rid of spider webbing, and don't clear away any lichens, because hummingbirds actually use spider web to bind the fibers in their nest, and it's really cool because it expands. So that's how, because hummingbird eggs are like little tiny things, and then the babies grow, and sometimes there are 2 or 3 of them, and the reason the nests can expand is because they use spider web for that. So never clear away any cobwebs or spider webs anywhere. They're your friends. So if you've got feeders, and also I don't know, I've seen hummingbird nests made out of all kinds of different fibers, but they're very meticulous about making them, and they like fine fibers and spider webbing. So I would say if you can make sure that you've got some nesting materials convenient, maybe that'll work. They also like to nest on little branches. So.
And this is another one from Lomerson V. Are there any aloe plants that can survive the extreme temperature differences in the AV Valley?
Oh, the AV Valley?
The Antelope Valley?
Extreme temperatures. Well, I'm trying to think of what I've seen in when I'm out in Palm Springs. I mean, the Hesperaloe, I don't know if you want things that grow in pots, that's a different question, but the Hesperaloe is so heat tolerant. I noticed that in Palm Springs, they use it for highway medians. And they're, how hot it gets there. So that's like that's my new hummingbird plant to love. I don't know if you can grow it in a pot, but it really is an amazing plant in the ground. It's very tough, very drought tolerant, super long bloom time, and the hummers love it.
And here's another one from Chelsea R. What kind of low maintenance native potted plants do you suggest putting in a concrete filled backyard in the middle of Los Angeles?
Oh, so native plants are tricky because a lot of California native plants are not that happy in pots. A lot of native plants in California the reason they're so drought tolerant is that they a lot of times put down tap roots, and so it's they're not that happy. Oh, I see Carol Bornstein has a Calliandra, so for hummingbirds. But Chelsea, my suggestion would be I would go to the Theodore Payne Foundation, and because they have a huge selection and a really great selection, and I used to be one of the sales yard volunteers, and I remember that came up quite a bit. People would want to know what natives they could grow in pots, for patios or things like that, and they actually have a lot of information there that can help you with that.
All right, and we have a couple more here, and then a few as well that we received before the webinar. Okay. So this is from Stephen F. Is it okay to dismantle nests after the family has left? I believe the birds were wrens. Are they likely to come back next year?
By dismantling the nest, the one thing I cut out of the talk because it takes a while to explain was the International Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And according to that legislation, it's actually illegal to in any way tamper with, take, collect, move, possess any birds, or eggs or feathers or anything. And there's a long story to why that's the case, because in the 19th century, believe it or not, there was a mania for collecting bird eggs, and there were several species of birds pushed to the brink of extinction because people were collecting their eggs. And also nest collecting for collections. If it's like, you know, they built a nest and it's in my porch light and now they seem to be done and gone, I think that it would be okay to remove the nest if you're sure that they're gone. But be careful though, because a lot of times empty nests have bird mites in them, and they can, I don't know, insects and invertebrates love me, so I try to avoid them.
What kind of birds do you get in your garden, and what's your favorite?
Oh, my garden, so the usual suspects that I get are California towhees, mourning doves, Bewick's wrens. One time I saw oak titmouses. I'm not really sure how that pluralizes. Sometimes I see hermit thrushes. One time, oh God, mockingbirds. How can I forget? Because they're everywhere. Mockingbirds. And one time a juvenile Cooper's hawk foolishly tried to get at the mockingbird nest, and I have never heard, it was this amazing commotion, because as you know, mockingbirds are the fiercest, most violent birds ever, and I thought they were going to dismember this poor Cooper's hawk. The hawk was like, and then he was trying to get away and he was stuck in the branches and was like, ah! I get a lot of hummers, and I found old hummingbird nests, so they must be nesting up there. What else do I get? Towhees. Hooded orioles show up. I was really surprised to find the hooded orioles really like the Mexican elderberry flowers or berries. I can't tell which. But that's really a treat to see them. And also Nuttall's woodpeckers. There are tons of acorn woodpeckers everywhere here. So I see those pretty much every morning when I go out to go to my car. But it's really a treat to see the Nuttall's woodpeckers. I'm always really happy when I see those. So I would say that's kind of like the special sighting. But they're all really entertaining to watch. And probably the ones I love the most are the Bewick's wrens, because they're so much fun to watch.
All right. Do you have any good books on crows and habits from Shirley K?
Crows?
Yes.
You know, my suggestion would be really the Bernd Heinrich books are really great. He writes a lot about ravens, but he's really into corvids. And he's written a lot, so I would check and see if he's actually written any books on crows.
All right, and I have a couple of comments just to finish out our Zoom questions. Sibley's Birding Basics is available as an ebook through Los Angeles Public Library, and there are other bird books too. Thank you for that, Christine M.
Thank you.
From Anne and Eric B as well. Roselia is a great drought-tolerant hummingbird plant and blooms all the time.
Oh, what is that again?
Roselia.
Oh yeah, Roselia. That's a great one. I sadly killed mine, but yeah, that's definitely, I've seen it in other people's yards with just hummingbirds hovering around it all the time.
All right, and then we still have a few from, this one came in from our Instagram account. Oh. This one is from Carol A. A bird nested on the porch light by my front door. What do I do to keep her safe and undisturbed?
Oh, so, okay. So the Bewick's wrens nested inside my Hoya, which is hanging literally like 1.5 feet from my front door. So I didn't want to move them. I didn't water the plant for 3 months, which fortunately it's a Hoya, so it was okay. So I would suggest keep your porch light turned off at night. Make sure that there's no excess lighting. So that's number one. And then I make sure that there's no way that a cat or a squirrel can get at the nest, because that was my other concern. I had a nest box actually in the Mexican elderberry tree, but then I realized that the squirrels are scampering around there all the time. And squirrels, don't let anybody fool you. They might be cute, but they'll eat anything they can get their mitts on. And one day I was at the zoo and I saw one take a baby sparrow out of the nest and eat it. So squirrels are, yeah. So I would say make sure there's no access to it from the ground, and then also turn off your porch light at night.
Thank you. And speaking of squirrels, are there any squirrel-proof or rat-proof bird feeders that you know of?
No, actually I don't, because I don't have any bird feeders for the very reason that I already wage enough of a conflict over my figs with every other animal that wants to eat the fig. The tree now makes enough fruit for all of us, so I've kind of given up the battle. There's enough for the squirrels, the jays, the mockingbirds, and me. And I've seen squirrels. I don't know. It's like building the better mousetrap. It's like a arms race, because I was at the zoo once and there was this elaborate bird feeder that had been constructed with, you know, this cone thing so that there was no way for the squirrel to get under it. But then I was out there, you know, one day and I watched this squirrel, and I swear you could see him doing calculus in his head, and he was in a tree about 2.5 feet away, and I could see him just, you know, doing all of this, and sure enough, he just launched himself over it and he managed to land on top of it and then eat the seeds that were in it. So it's kind of rats and squirrels, difficult competition for seeds. So
can you suggest a good source to buy organic bird seed or bird food? Wow.
You know, I would go online and search around, because I don't know, you know, Wild Birds Unlimited has a lot of birding supplies, but I'm pretty sure you could probably find organic bird seed online, and you might even be able to mail order it. Oh, Carol has a squirrel-proof feeder.
Oh, at the Natural History Museum. All right. Another one, this is the second to last. I provide water for birds, but only one sparrow has found the bowl in my patio and visits it several times a day. How do I get him to tell his friends and family about the water source? Only one bird visits my main patio for the past 5 years.
So my question for you, which is, so if the water is kind of sitting there on the patio, or if it has shrubbery and plants around it, I think is going to be the big difference. Because if it's out in the open, the birds are not going to be too confident about that, because again, there are predators everywhere, and just like the all-you-can-eat buffet for the hawk coming and taking birds that were at the feeder, I would assume that the same is true of a water source. So maybe providing some shelter, or if you can move it so that it's under some shrubbery or some overhanging branches, might attract more different birds to your water.
All right, thank you, Sandy. And actually that was the last one, because the last one on here was one we already answered about how to bring more colorful birds to Los Angeles.
Awesome.
Well,
I'm so excited that so many people are into birding. Go out and bird and report your findings. Go to iNaturalist, go to eBird, report what you find. Take lots of pictures.
Thank you. And then all of the resources that you provided to here, all the websites that you mentioned as well, will you also be able to provide a list of birds, or the bird plant list, excuse me.
Oh, the one that was in my talk?
Yes.
Yes, I can. I'll give you a PDF of the whole thing.
Perfect. All right, thank you, Sandy. Thank you everyone for joining us. And again, look out for our next webinar next month. It will be great.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Have a good night, everyone.
Have fun birding.